Welcome to I'm Not Joking, the podcast where a behavioral scientist examines what it's like to live a humorous life. Glimpse into the lives of the funniest people in entertainment, business, and science as your host, Dr. Peter McGraw, explores their habits, motivations, and secrets to success. Get ready to fire up your brain and your funny bone. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to I'm Not Joking, the podcast that looks at the lives of funny people. I'm Peter McGraw. Today's guest is Shane Snow. Shane is an award-winning journalist, entrepreneur, and the author of 3 books, including the #1 business bestseller, Dream Teams. He speaks about innovation and teamwork, has performed comedy on Broadway, and has been published in GQ, Fast Company, Wired, and The New Yorker. Welcome, Shane.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Thanks for fitting me in during your trip to LA.
Yeah, I come here all the time, and it seems like every time it's a 2-day whirlwind of meetings, and I should just spend a month here someday. You're kind of on a sabbatical here
I'm
in LA, right?
4.5 months in. Yes, it's going well. The thing about LA that's different than New York is you can do 6 meetings in a day in New York, and you can do 3 meetings a day in LA.
Yeah, and 7 hours of driving.
Indeed. So, Shane, if you weren't working as a writer, performer, or entrepreneur, what would you be doing with your life?
Oh, I really like cars and aerospace stuff. And my dad was an auto mechanic and then became an aerospace engineer. Now he's a nuclear engineer. So I grew up with this fascination for engineering, and I really love my dad and kind of respect what he does. So I think if I wasn't doing this, I would be doing something in that.
Neat. Are you a math guy?
I was, yeah.
Okay.
I like to think of myself as a writer who uses science and math thinking to put together ideas in different ways. But I was in middle school. I was on the math team for math counts.
Nice.
I went to nationals and got my ass kicked. I represented Idaho, and I think I got last place, or like second to last. But that's where my mom has a photo on the wall of her house of me on the U.S. Capitol steps with the senator from Idaho with his arm around my shoulder, and I'm in 8th grade and with a math trophy or whatever. And it turns out that that is the guy, like the one Idaho senator anyone's heard of. He's the guy that was arrested for soliciting prostitutes in a bathroom of the airport.
Oh, I remember that guy.
Yeah, so that's the guy with his arm around me.
What a strange place to look for a prostitute.
Yeah, I don't even know the whole of that story, but all I know is I think that my mom's very proud of me for that photo, and I think she doesn't quite realize that it's that guy.
I see.
On the wall with me.
Mrs. Snow, I hope you're not listening to this podcast.
The most important is that she's very proud of her kids.
Yes.
She's the reason why we were ambitious into that sort of thing. So
yeah, that's great. So let's step back for a second. You use science and math to put together a story.
So I like to think of my process that I've developed over my journalism career as kind of like the process of taking apart a car engine or some other thing, looking at all of the pieces and then reassembling it. So when I'm working on a story, that's what I like to do. I like to go all the way back to kind of the first principles. Okay. I think a lot of journalists will do this where they'll make the spider diagram of here's the person I'm writing about, here's all of their connections, here's all of their connections.
Like in the movies or TV, like the cork board with the person and then the thumbtacks and the strings and
like
so
they
on.
Went to the yarn store and got yarn so they can chart out this thing on their wall.
Do you literally do that?
My house right now, there's one of the walls is all windows, and it's all sticky notes right now for a very big story project that I'm working on. So it's usually sticky notes, and I don't know what the yarn or the rubber bands are for in the movies. But I do like to think of it as a scientific process of breaking things down and actually going through the scientific method. The reason I'm writing about this is because of an observation that I've had, and now I have a question about it. Now I'm going to run through some hypotheses and do all of the research and connect all the dots in order to disprove that hypothesis, and doing that over and over again. So that's where there's kind of this science and math component of it.
Yeah, indeed. So obviously you probably don't want to talk about this story, but can we look back at a previous story where you kind of did this process? Can you take the listener through it?
Sure. So let's see. My most recent book is about teamwork, and it was a bit of a kind of chipping away at the marble until it became the book about teamwork, but I was interested in a whole bunch of different threads, I guess, that I was pulling on, different mini investigations, different questions that I had, that eventually I wrote a bunch of stuff and it coalesced around this idea of teamwork. One of them, for example, was I came across this research about police officers and police partnerships that shoot people and make mistakes, and police officers that don't. And I came across a statistic that basically women cops shoot fewer people. And if you're a male cop partnered with a woman, you will shoot fewer people. And you'll be more confident in your decisions. You'll make fewer mistakes. So I came across that study, and the question was, well, why?
And is part of the... I'm sorry, you
Sure.
go. I want to say, because I'm immediately going to a lack of confidence leads to, right? You can make two errors. One is too much force, the other one's too little.
Yeah, that's part of it. So,
Okay.
so the question
Sorry.
You're getting at, the hypothesis
Yeah,
stage of
so
that,
I'm
right?
sorry, yeah.
Observation is there's this interesting set of statistics. Question is why?
Mm-hmm.
And what is it about gender that might lead to this? And is it just gender that would lead to this?
And gender's a proxy for something else, of course, and so on.
Right.
Yes.
And so there's all sorts of hypotheses that came out of that. The winning hypothesis, as sort of the hypothesis that is the umbrella to the answer, is that when you have two people in law enforcement working together, if they don't or can't assume that they think the same, they will be more cautious in their decision making.
Okay.
And so if you have two male cops that assume that we're going to kick down the door because that's how I think and you think how I think, they'll kick down the door versus try to compromise the person who has the key or some other way. And so what started happening when women started becoming law enforcement officers and detectives and everything else, you couldn't be in the FBI, an agent in the FBI if you were female until after Hoover died. But when that started happening, all these interesting things started happening. And there are two effects, really. One is that if you're working with someone who isn't like you, you will tend to think differently just by nature of that.
Sure.
You can't make assumptions like you could otherwise. And the second is that other person is bringing a different point of view to the table. So when together you're negotiating, how do we solve this problem? In police work especially, turns out it's mostly social work. You're dealing with people who are having problems with each other. And when there's two of you that are bringing a different perspective to that on-the-job problem solving, you will do a better job and you'll be more confident in your decision-making afterwards. So some of it does come down to this sort of use of force is a default tool that a lot of men who become police officers have because there's a bias towards that in the process. And I interviewed a lot of women in law enforcement or like at ATF and some of these big government agencies that said that because they knew at a young age that they couldn't win against boys in the arm wrestling in middle school or whatever it was, and then they got to the academy and they knew that they weren't going to be able to, knock down the door as well as the men in the group, generally speaking, they developed other heuristics for negotiating, and those end up being very valuable in a partnership.
Especially because the average cop does very little knocking down doors.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Sometimes you need to. Honestly, like once in a while you need
Sure,
that.
yeah, that's right.
But that's one of many tools you have in your toolkit. And you alluded to something as well. It turns out that two female cops are going to be at a disadvantage from a problem-solving standpoint as well, because it's more likely, again, speaking in generalities and statistics, it's more likely that they will think similarly on certain things.
So it's not a female effect, it's a diversity effect.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
I'm going to guess that you came across some of Anita Woolley's work on this. So Anita Woolley is a professor at Carnegie Mellon.
Yes.
Who does work on what she calls collective intelligence rather than general intelligence.
Yep.
So as you know, I'm working on a book. It's coming out soon. And
are you revealing any of the secrets yet?
A little bit here and there. I'm
okay.
Sprinkling them in. So one of the chapters is called Cooperate to Innovate. It's really about the value of teamwork in terms of making something. So a single person can have a great idea, but if you want to make something, you need other people.
Yep.
And so obviously the book is using comedy as the genesis, as the examples for these ideas, and then I'm applying them in business.
Oh, I love that.
And so the idea of like complementation in comedy is really important, right? So part of the reason why Chappelle's Show was so good was the co-creator was a white guy, and so a black and white co-creator, black and white co-writers have a much stronger repertoire, have a better overall perspective than
they're bringing more to the pool that you draw from for comedy.
Yes.
Because they've lived lives with different perspectives and they've navigated the world differently.
Some overlapping and some different and so on. And so Anita's work is really cool because she talks about adding women to a group increases the collective intelligence, not because they're women per se, but because women tend to possess this sort of ability to be sort of more socially tuned in and thus flexible. And what she shows is that adding women increases the overall team's performance, but a team of all women shows a decrease.
Interesting.
Again, for these same kind of reasons. Again, gender is a proxy for other traits.
Right. It's the way that you see the world, the heuristics you've developed to navigate the world. And there's some things that, everything's a spectrum, right?
Yes.
There's some things that are built in biologically, but a lot of stuff has to do with how the world has treated you because of who you are and what you look like and how you've learned to compensate or navigate.
That's right. To develop, this works for me.
Yeah. So the phrase that I always use, that my conclusion that I came to from this and the other studies that had to do with it, is that two heads are only better than one if they see things differently.
Oh, that's nice.
So it doesn't matter what the group is composed of, what their demographics are. If they think similarly, they're not going to be better than the smartest one of those thinkers. But if they think differently, they can be.
I'm writing this down. It's important.
And what's cool, coming back to the mathematicians have actually borne this out. They've developed mathematical models for how a group of diverse thinkers can become smarter than the smartest person. And that stuff gets really nerdy and fascinating, but it can be summed up as smartest or most powerful person will be the constraining factor.
Yes, they dominate. Yeah.
Unless everyone thinks a little bit differently.
Yeah, that's great. Anita's work is, first of all, it's incredibly thorough. The work that they've put into it is really fascinating and strong. I want to talk more about dream teams in a moment, but okay, so you have this process. Have you written out the process, or is this just something that you sort of intuit and know well enough that you can just kind of execute it project and project and project? Because it seems like you know where I'm going with this.
I've sort of arrived at this. I've started writing about my process. Each book that I've written behind the scenes where I've documented my process, and I share the link with other writer friends. Okay. And each one has gotten better. So I've sort of refined this process. Now I have this sort of kooky thing that I do with sticky notes where during the research phase of something, I'm taking all sorts of notes and I'm organizing them and reorganizing them, and I will transfer the sticky note diagram to pen and pad, and then I'll transfer that to more sticky notes in a different order, and then I'll transfer that to a different medium. And it's this changing of media that helps me to think through and reorganize my thoughts.
Yeah.
So it's sort of a weird process, but that's how I've developed it. But the underlying framework is the scientific method.
Yeah, I see. That's neat. I like the idea, again, so I want to talk about your books, not mine, but I have, one of the chapters is about writing. And so I like the idea that you're taking the thing that's on the wall and you're writing it down. My argument is there's a benefit to putting pen to paper in terms of clarifying ideas, remembering them, and so on.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm interested in what you see the benefit as, because I have my theory.
Well, so first of all, I'd say is that some of this is not well researched. Mm-hmm. And so this is more of I see it in the world of comedy, I see it in my world. And to be honest, the average person abhors writing, and so they avoid it at all costs.
Yeah.
And my argument is that we think about writing in the wrong way. We think about writing as just a means to communicate ideas. But I think that's only one of the three values of writing. One of the values is recording ideas. And the research does bear this out. There's something special about writing an idea down versus typing it, for example, or reading what someone else has written.
Yeah. I have a buddy he's a columnist for Wired Magazine, named Clive Thompson.
I know that name.
Yeah, he's
awesome.
He has
a book.
He has a couple books.
Yeah.
His Smarter Than You Think is his first one, and then Coders is his most recent one.
I don't know that one, yeah.
He's great. He's one of my mentors. I aspire to be as good a writer as him. But he wrote this wonderful piece on Medium maybe a year or two ago about why he takes notes by hand and he composes by typing. And basically the conclusion is, if you're taking notes by typing, you will do a lot more sort of transcribing what the writer or what the speaker is saying. If you take notes by hand, you can't keep up, so you have to synthesize. And in that synthesization process, you remember more, but you also make connections a little bit better because the shorthand you have to use forces you to be a little creative. Yes. And a lot of the creative process is about combining different things. So that's part of my excuse why I have handwriting as part of my process. I'm taking my notes. If I'm writing them down, then there is some synthesis that increases my chance of having some creative moments. But the typing for composition is basically about your brain is faster than you can write by hand. But if you are a fast typer, you can keep up. So if you know what you want to say, you know what you want to write down. And this is part of my process too. I do all the research and all the thinking, all the outlining. And then when I sit down to write, I do it in these sort of manic bursts where I'll go to Mexico City for 2 months and I will drink coffee and write for 12 hours a day.
Wow.
because I'm not thinking about what I need to write at that point. I'm just getting it out. And that's where the flying fingers thing is more helpful than composing by hand.
I see. That's neat. That assumes you have clarity on the ideas.
Yes.
To me, the second thing is that the actual writing clarifies ideas.
Yes.
Like, we can be a little fast and loose with ideas because we're talking about them right now because they're not really being checked. But when you have to put them into words and sentences, it leads to, wait, those two things don't go together and, and that kind of thing. So
my little brother is a creative fiction writer, and he's a much more brilliant writer than I am. It's easier to get paid if you're writing about business and science, mostly if you're writing about business than if you're writing fiction. But he's so brilliant, and he does his first drafts by hand because his first draft is really part of his thinking process.
Yes, right.
But then when he types up his final drafts, it's typing.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
That's great. So let's get back to Dream Teams a bit. So let's just compare some notes. So the other idea in that chapter, I talk about listening and the value of listening. And so do Dream Teams have special listening skills?
Yes, and there's a particular component of the formula that I think a special kind of listening is really effective and important. The formula essentially that underlies teams that make breakthroughs together is cognitive diversity. So we've talked about that.
Yes, right.
And then you need that cognitive diversity to actually mash together what I call cognitive friction.
Okay.
So you have to combine the ideas. You have to actually smash them together.
Okay.
And there's lots of really cool, fun research about that. But you need to have the debate, essentially. And then the third component is intellectual humility, which is basically you need to be willing to revise your viewpoint or change. I use this analogy, not in the book, but I use the analogy of baking a cake. You're not going to get cake out of 8 different types of flour. You need different ingredients to make something different. But you need to actually mix the ingredients into batter for you to actually get cake. If you just have the different people or the different ideas, but you don't let them combine and have a little discomfort as a result, you're not going to get something new. But then you also need to bake the cake. There needs to be a chemical transformation where it becomes something new. And this intellectual humility thing, I think, is a really interesting vein of psychology. And it's the last couple chapters of the book. But I talk about why is it so hard for us to change our minds, to revise our viewpoints, to get better. And especially, ironically, why is it hard for smart people and successful people to change? And when you break intellectual humility down, the first component of it is respect for other viewpoints.
Okay.
And that is defined not just as not hating people who think different than you, but it's hearing out and listening to other viewpoints, even if you initially disagree with them, you're initially offended by them, but hearing them out all the way through before you cast a judgment. And the extreme version of this is having a general respect for all viewpoints means that if Hitler is telling you his point of view, you'll listen first before you decide whether it's bad or not.
I see.
It doesn't mean you have to agree with him, but it means that you will explore the points of view and then combine that with what you think to make a decision whether you should change. And that's where teams that can do this, they can have the debates actually be more productive because they're exploring intellectual territory rather than shutting down, I'm not going to listen because what you say sounds crazy or it's too far out or we don't think this way. If you actually listen to it and then you say, well, thank you. It's kind of the yes and. What can we pull from this that is helpful and what are we going to leave behind?
Yeah.
That's really effective.
I love that because I spend a lot of time talking about listening. I use improv, obviously, as the key context for that. However, you actually, for example, as a stand-up, need to be listening, right? So what are people laughing at and what are they not laughing at? And are you going to deviate from your set list? How are you going to make changes? Are you going to, are you going to riff more with the audience, right? Even stand-ups who look like they're doing theater have to demonstrate a lot of listening skills.
So I wrote about this in my first book. I spent some time with Second City, how you build up your material.
Yes.
Right? By testing.
That's right.
You know what's going to hit and what people will laugh at, and then you test something, and then you listen to see how they react to it, and then you revise it, iterate it, and it either goes into your permanent repertoire or you throw it out.
Exactly.
The same thing with public speaking. It's not just laughs. So when I talk to business crowds about some of my writing,
right,
often I will work in humor because it helps people remember things better. But if I notice that people are taking pictures of the screen at any point in my talk, that's a cue for me that I need to double down on that, or I need to zero in on that more the next time. And it's a different kind of listening. It's more of an observation than
that's a form of listening, I think.
I
mean, I push metaphor pretty far. Yeah, and one of my takes in this is we want to look beyond yes and. Right? Yes and is useful when it comes to teams, but in improv also they edit, right? So someone decides when a scene's over. That's not a yes and situation. Like you need both yes and we're done.
That's interesting.
Right?
I like that. Yeah, pull people, stop it before they go off the cliff.
That's exactly right. Like, so you want someone who comes off the back wall and goes, we just had our big laugh. We're at the peak. This is done.
Yeah.
That's not a yes and. And so what's happened is improv has gotten to be just this yes and thing.
Right.
And that's a very small part of teamwork, I think. At some point, someone's got to make a decision. Or at some point, someone's got to disagree or whatever it is. It's just, I think it's a process where you start with that and then at some point it stops.
It's interesting because I've been thinking about this thing recently. I'm starting to write a little bit in some of my posts. I'm really fascinated by debate and by brainstorming and how debate is better than brainstorming, but how do you have a debate that works really well? And I've been looking at a lot of this brainstorming research where a lot of people have written about brainstorming studies say that groups of people, when they brainstorm ideas together, usually are stupider than if they do it on their own. And what's better is those same people preparing and having debate about those ideas. But when you break that down, what kind of debate actually leads to new ideas rather than culling bad ideas? And there's kind of this two-step process, I think. One is, I forget the word that I've come across that I liked, but this idea of spidering out ideas. You start with one thing, and then it becomes two things. You start with those, and they become four things. It's kind of this yes and process. So you're kind of spreading the range of possibilities, but then there's this process of going back and poking holes in those ideas and finding what really works and narrowing that down. If you're trying to solve a problem, it's not that useful to just come up with a billion ideas. You have to then decide which are the best ideas.
Yes.
So this comes back to the scientific method of trying to disprove the hypotheses and making that the game. So I've been thinking about that idea, this two-step, and I think it works just as well in comedy. Potentially, if you're trying to write a sketch or you're trying to write a movie, it's not just about this in-the-moment improv thing. You're going to explore a lot of things, but then you're going to narrow it down to the thing that gets the best response, and that's going to go into the movie or that's going to go into the sketch. I wish I could bring to mind that term, but those two parts of the process I think are a really interesting way to look at it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think the fascinating thing is when you're doing any of this stuff on your own, it's already complex. And then you add other human beings, and it gets really complex.
Yes.
But I think the issue is that I think of group genius. You know, like almost any time you point to someone as a solo genius, there are exceptions, of course, but most of the time you start digging, there's someone else there, or there's someone else, like someone's else there, especially if that person's doing more than making an idea.
Yeah. And you often see these people who are the genius, and Steve Jobs is the one that everyone always uses,
Of course,
right?
I talk about it, yeah.
Yeah, and he had Johnny Ive, and he had a lot of people working for him, right?
Yes.
But you even notice then that he had so much power, and he was so brilliant, that when he passed away, I mean, the organization had to figure out how to be as smart as he was, and that's sort of a weird position to be in.
Yes.
I think it's really interesting for the leader to see their job as making the organization smarter than them, rather than them being the one. And I think that actually was what was afoot with Steve Jobs, but so much of that mythology resided in him, and the organization, I think, was used to having this leader that could conduct the orchestra like he did.
Yes.
So I think that's a paradigm shift in general, I think, with the way we should think about leadership. It used to be the caveman days, the leader we picked was the one who was strong and gave us confidence that they could solve the problems with the saber-toothed tiger. And then after a while, the leader that we would pick in society was the one that made us confident that they had all the answers, right? The smart ones, the ones that, and often the ones that don't back down on what they think. And I think in the future, the leaders that we really need are the ones that can unlock the brilliance of the group underneath them, rather than being the one to have all the answers.
I like that a lot. I actually make this argument that it's a counterfactual, which is what could have Steve Jobs done if he wasn't such a dick? Like, I mean, we say, wow, look what he accomplished. And I go, iPhone, iPad, iPod, right? Those are the big three.
Right.
And you go, well, could there have been three others? You know what I mean? Like, that's the counterfactual. We have a tendency to be like, okay, this was the pinnacle. And I'm like, oh, well, maybe.
Yeah, are we conflating his abrasiveness with his success? I think there's a lot of entrepreneurs that say that they take the wrong things from what he did. And so much of it is what you're saying. You don't see who behind the scenes are helping push things forward. Even with Elon Musk, everyone talks about him as this great genius, which he is. But you read the biography of him, and his brother Kimball is a huge part of why he has been successful and hasn't gone too far and hasn't imploded.
Yeah.
And and many more people. His genius really, I think, has been being able to inspire brilliant people to work for him and to pursue the mission that he has, not to solve all the problems himself.
Yeah. I mean, the other one, and while we're talking about tech, and then I'd like to pivot before people fall asleep, is I think when we look back at Bill Gates's legacy, we get to thank Melinda.
Yeah.
I just think that guy was not built to be a great humanitarian. He needed a partner to help guide that genius and those things. And then as a team, those two are much better than they would be individually.
And I think the Gates Foundation is more important than Microsoft. And
in the long run,
in 100 years from now, that will be the thing that has made the most impact on the world.
Yeah, that's right. Same way the Ford Foundation or Getty or whatever it is tends to be. I want to talk about speaking, but before I want to jump back to Smart Cuts. That's your first book. Yes. That's how we met.
My freshman effort.
So Smart Cuts feels like a little bit of a poo-poo platter of ideas.
Yep.
And then now what you're doing is you're taking one idea and you're kind of diving more deeply into it.
I think that's an interesting way to put it. Smart Cuts was...
Give the listener, like, what's your favorite Smart Cut that we haven't talked about?
That we haven't talked about. I really like... my favorite one.
Well, not favorite. Okay, just one of them.
No, yeah. I explore this principle of radical simplicity. Right now, people are talking about radical everything, radical candor, radical whatever.
Well, this was 10 years ago.
Yeah, it was a while ago. So radical simplicity is this design principle that things tend to get more complex over time.
Yeah. I call it feature creep.
Yes, feature creep.
Yeah.
And a lot of great innovation actually asks the question, what's the one essential component of this thing? Strips the product down to that one essential component and then tries to make that better. So I go through Picasso. He had a period where at a time when art was great if it was realistic, he would draw like a realistic thing, like a bull, and then he would break it down into the fewest number of lines possible. And you can see these great progressions of like complicated bull to a bull drawn from 8 lines that looks awesome. Really pissed people off in the art world, but he saw the beauty and the innovation potential in simplicity. You look at...
In my opinion, is good art is all about innovation. It's doing something that no one else has done before.
Absolutely.
That's really where...
Yeah.
What makes art interesting.
Yeah, so I tell this story of one of my favorite people in the world. Her name's Jane Chen. She decided to start working on helping basically save premature babies who are born in countries where there's not very good health care. So if you're born in a village in Pakistan and you're born 2.5 months early, you're probably going to die.
Okay.
But if you're born in Southern California, you're probably going to live. And it's because we have these incubators in hospitals that cost $20,000 that they just don't have access to in Pakistan. So she tried to solve this problem. How do you make the baby incubator 100 times cheaper? In doing so, at first they tried to make a cheaper incubator, right? Cheaper glass box, and try to make it more efficient design-wise and cut costs, cut corners. And they couldn't do it. 100 times cheaper is just way too much. So that forced them to step back and ask a different question, which is how do you keep a baby warm? Because it turns out that the number one thing that a baby needs if it's born premature is heat.
Yes.
90% of cases, that's all it is it's just being the right temperature for the last 2 months. And so the question was, how do you keep a baby the right temperature for 100 times cheaper than
You don't need an incubator for that.
You need a sleeping bag.
Yes.
Yeah, and so they invented this sleeping bag for babies that has a little heating pad, and it's so simple, you don't need to know how to read in order to figure out how to use it. And they're able to make them for way more than 100 times cheaper than an incubator. They've saved millions of babies' lives. So that principle, the Smart Cut, I guess, is this question of what if we had to make this so much simpler that we can't just cut costs or cut the design down. We have to actually think outside the box because that's the only way to solve the problem. And that forces you to really narrow down to what's the essential problem at hand.
See. I don't know if you know this, but I'm going to risk making an obvious observation, which is I can see why you like that so much because it mirrors your scientific process.
Yeah,
which
I guess
is
so.
Right? Which is what is the problem? What is the solution? There are multiple solutions to this problem. Let's not focus on the existing solution.
Yes.
Right. So
try and reinvent it. Yeah. So Smart Cuts was a bit of a potpourri. It was 9 chapters of different ways to kick yourself out of the box, so to speak, and approach problems differently in the effort of speeding up success or speeding up innovation. And I do call it a freshman effort because I look back on it now and I think that it's not as cohesive as I would write it today.
Uh-huh.
And is also way too ambitious for, someone in their 20s to write a first book. But I'm glad to have done it because it has been the kickoff point for a lot of my work. And I still get a lot of readers writing in saying, I've made this incredible thing, and Smartcuts was a book that inspired me.
Oh, that's great.
Which is, pretty awesome.
Yeah. I mean, it's a fun book. Obviously, I read it back then. And my sophomore book writing effort is like your freshman book writing effort. So
nice
now, these books are obviously fueling some speaking. So you're in LA, you gave a talk today.
Yep, the Roosevelt.
So for the listener who doesn't know, the Roosevelt is a classic Hollywood hotel on Hollywood Boulevard, right across from the Chinese Theater, the Mann Theater there.
It's where Audrey Hepburn got her Oscar, I just learned, for Roman Holiday.
Yeah, it's got a great pool, it's got a great vibe, it's got these great bars, there's like a little bowling alley in there, and it's sort of surprisingly affordable. So just the only problem is you have to deal with Hollywood Boulevard.
It's right in the middle. It's the one place.
It's a total shit show.
Yeah.
That's the one downside of it all. So you were asking me about my speaking. So my speaking is starting to ramp up a bit because now I have a keynote. I have work that is directly applicable to business. So I've given a lot of like public talks and I kind of sort of speak often, but in terms of doing it as a professional, that's just really getting rolling for me. But you have your feet under you with this. And so I want to use you for a little while. I want you to, I've seen you talk. You gave a talk at a salon recently that I was at.
And that was a rather improvised one, so I was more nervous than usual.
I think you did fine. And you talked about this idea of intellectual humility as part of it. And I remember the one thing about it, I actually wrote in my notes here, is Shane's a good storyteller. You're sort of a natural storyteller. You're a honed storyteller. Here's the thing is, I know you're a good storyteller, but I can't off the top of my head remember the story you told.
It was about Malcolm X.
That's exactly right. Which I was familiar with Malcolm X, obviously, and recognized his importance in terms of the civil rights movement, but I didn't know the specifics of that story. And so I really like when I read something or see a speaker tell me something that feels familiar, and thus it's fluent, but gives me something new.
Yeah.
And one of the really nice things about it, I'll let you tell the quick 50-word version of this, is it allows me to like Malcolm X a lot more than I felt like I was allowed to like him.
Oh, that's cool. That was exactly what happened to me. The short version of the story is Malcolm X had a very hard life, and he changed his mind in a very dramatic way a couple of times. Did something that's very hard for most of us to do. He switched religions, and he was in prison at a young age. He had a very, very hard upbringing. He went to prison for theft. While he was in prison, he went from being the guy that they all called Satan with a super foul mouth to being this very kind person. And then he got out of prison and he helped build up this fledgling new religion, was their main star preacher. Then he realized that he didn't believe in it and publicly, and that he believed some other things too. And he had been preaching against the civil rights movement. This is a part that a lot of people don't know about his story. Dr. King and Bayard Rustin and all of the people pushing the civil rights movement forward, very worried about Malcolm X. They disavowed him. They said he didn't represent their views because he hated the idea of peace. He wanted
segregation,
wanted segregation. He actually started brokering a deal with the American Nazi Party. He had no reason to like, but they had the same goal, which was keep the races apart. And he did some other things that were pretty unpleasant. And then he went to Mecca. He converted to Sunni Islam. He changed his mind on a bunch of things, made an about face, and became this very key voice in the civil rights movement that helped get a lot of disenfranchised people on board with Dr. King and helped push Dr. King's thinking. And he did that knowing that it would get him killed, and it did. That's the short version of the story. But
the irony is he became more threatening the more peaceful he became.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And he, even in his last few weeks of life, he said some things in some of his sermons that were way ahead of his time. He talked about how you should be able to love whoever you wanted to, and that shouldn't be anyone else's business. He talked about how men were equal to women and how women should hold positions of authority. And these were things that he had preached against before that also were not very socially acceptable in the 60s. And ironically, we've come a long way. And he started preaching the opposite, and that message of peace was what got him killed.
Yeah, fascinating. I love the story. I enjoyed your talk. So, all right. So, for me, I've got this, I don't want to call it a great keynote because that's not me showing any humility.
I'm sure it's fun.
But it's the best one I've developed. in terms of it's got the like 1-2 punch of education and entertainment and so on.
Nice.
Yeah. Like, what advice do you give to the person who's thinking about trying to maybe not make a living, but have a hustle in this world?
So I did not envision myself becoming a public speaker as my main source of income.
Yeah. I mean, you're a writer at heart.
But as you know, writing doesn't pay the bills quite the same as being paid to speak. It's ironic. But I actually think of the writing process as a step.
To me, it's the clarifying step.
Yeah.
And then it's a communication step. Like, people are like, hey, I got an idea.
Exactly. And as a writer, I'm doing it because I want people to hear these ideas. I want to teach. And what better way to do that than to get up in front of people? And if you get paid a lot of money to speak, it feels a little weird at first, but then you think about the thousands of hours you spent writing the thing that you're now speaking about. It feels a little less weird.
And most people don't read, which is unfortunate.
Yeah.
But they're happy to listen.
So I think it's a very powerful thing. And I guess over the years, I've given a lot of speeches now, and I've gotten good, I'd say. Not great, but I've gotten good, quite good. I have a ways to go. But I think about the process as kind of a little bit what we were talking about before, as a constant iteration and refining process, much like a stand-up comic would do. That at this point, I know I have my 3 main topics, one for each book. And then there's a few ways that I can go with each of those keynotes. But I have stuff that I know hits every time. And I will usually do that. And then I will have some amount of customization for the client. So just barely, I was at a travel conference, it's business travelers. And so there was a couple of things that I put in specifically for that. And then I'll often put in 10 to 20% new material, new stories or new things to see how it goes. And if it goes well, then I will incorporate that into the main talk. But I kind of try to do what I do with my writing, which is what you said, a mix of education and entertainment. I like to use stories as a way to get people hooked and paying attention and not wanting to be on their phone or use the bathroom or whatever. I want them to hold it until I get to the end of the story.
Yes.
So I will start with the story, end on a cliffhanger, talk about the principles and, whatever it is that's like the medicine, and then I will end the story and hopefully with a bit of a surprise. That's the format I like to do. And if it's a longer talk, I'll do that 3 times, or I'll kind of wrap it in one big story. So I'll often, I'll start with the cliffhanger thing and then go through 3 mini principles. And by the end, I come back to that thing that was a cliffhanger, and then surprise, just like in comedy, there's callbacks from the middle of the talk that end up having to do with that first story. So I like to do that kind of process. And I really have noticed that a lot of these, especially corporate speaking clients, they want you to inform people, inspire people, but really they want you to entertain people. So if you're not doing that, then it's not a success. And if all you do is entertain people and no one learns anything, they still go away happy.
Yeah, so I had, in a previous episode, I had a professional speaker. I mean, he does it full time. His name's Mark Sanborn, and Mark's a very bright guy, an incredibly accomplished Hall of Fame speaker. And he talked about the idea of, he calls it big E and little e. And so big E to the power of little e, where the big E is education, something to teach and tell people. And then the little e is the entertainment part of it. But it's not plus, it's to the exponent.
Yeah, I like that.
And so I think that fits the model that you just described, which is you can be really light on the entertainment, but if you have a big little e, you get this exponential effect. But if you have both, then you're through the roof.
And also, if people don't laugh, if it's a dead crowd, it's okay, because they're ultimately to teach something. Or if the laugh is just real small, it's okay. I've found that versus just purely standing up and doing comedy, it's less terrifying to give kind of a business talk with comedy than to just be up there and people are like, all right, make me laugh. They
want to walk away with something.
Yeah, there's more pressure that way. And when I have done more pure comedy, I've tried to do it in a similar way where you're learning a story or you're learning something from it.
I see.
So there's something to talk about even if you didn't laugh. And that's a little bit of me hedging because it's nerve-wracking to do. But I think that's actually a theme in a lot of my work. I like anything where I can kill 2 birds with one stone, but it also is sort of a hedge.
I see. So what I hear you saying is you build the story into this using the cliffhanger. As my co-author from the Humor Code, Joel Warner, would say, you hang the baby over the cliff. And they're like, I got to stick around and find out what happens to that baby. And then the other thing is this sort of iterative process of really paying attention to what's happening, safely testing out 10 to 20% of your sort of new material. It's funny, I gave a talk yesterday in Indianapolis at this advertising conference. So it was a 25-minute talk. So there were 8 speakers. And I finished, we did a little Q&A, and then I found the quiet space. And I made revisions right then.
Nice.
Wow, it was super fresh. Even if some were little tweaks, like, the order of these slides should just be flipped. And
yeah, the questions I get after talks are often fuel for the next post I'm going to investigate and write.
Interesting.
And I mean, Dream Teams actually came out of questions from my other books. And the new stuff that I'm working on now is coming out of the questions I'm getting from Dream Teams. So that's part of the process too. There's something else that I actually wanted to ask you about with the benign violation theory. Is it now a law? Is it still a theory?
Here's the thing. We call it the benign violation theory, but when we write about it for a series journal, we call it the benign violation hypothesis.
Okay. Well, so with benign violation...
I wish it was a law, man.
Yeah.
That's very nice of you to say.
I think about it all the time when I'm writing.
For the listener, there's a difference between a theory and a law. Like, a law is considered truth.
It's been proven so much that there's no question. Yeah.
That's very kind.
Yeah. Well, so there's a twist on it that I do a lot in my writing and I'll do in my speaking often, where I will start telling a story and then I will reveal that the character in the story is someone that you know or is not who you thought it was. Or, I'll sort of zoom out and there's a twist. This is and the senator was Abraham Lincoln. Or twist. This is this kid that we're telling the story about is Skrillex. And I do that a lot. And I've done it more and more as I've gotten feedback on it. It usually doesn't get a laugh when I do that sort of thing in a crowd, but it does get like this, people sort of, and I don't know what to call that. And it's kind of a violation, but it's not quite. And I'm wondering if that fits at all into
the benign violation law
thing. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so the answer is no, it doesn't, but I have an answer for you. So I've tussled with this idea a lot. And so what I like to say is the benign violation theory is a theory of ha-ha. So it's a theory of humor, that is, the things that we laugh at, are amused by, and judge as funny. It's not a theory of aha. Okay, right. And so what is often the case is that the best comedy combines ha-ha and aha. Right? So ha-ha might be a dick joke.
Right.
Ha-ha plus aha is a dick joke that makes you think differently about dicks.
Right.
And so...
okay, yeah.
And so, but what's fascinating is that not all ahas, in the same way that ha-has aren't ahas, not all ahas are ha-has.
Got it.
So your Skrillex aha, what it is it's a moment of insight. And I'll post the paper on the exhibits and I'll email you the paper. There's a paper in Psychological Science about aha experiences.
Oh, awesome.
And what it is that aha experiences, whether they are related to comedy or related to solving a mathematical puzzle or inventing something, you know what I mean, whatever it might be, has these two elements to it. So one is it feels like a flash.
Yeah.
It feels sudden. And the second is it feels pleasurable.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so what is that essentially it's sort of solving a problem suddenly. And what you're doing when you say, and this is Skrillex, is you're handing the audience this aha.
Yeah.
Assuming they know who Skrillex is, right? You know what I mean? Or, they know it's Abraham Lincoln, and then they go, And what happens is that they feel the pleasure of it being bestowed on them almost in the same way that they would get the pleasure if they're like, this sounds like Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
They're right about it, yes.
And then they're right about it. And so,
cool. So, and it's not a violation because it's a reveal.
That's right. Yeah. So it's not a form of play.
Yep.
It's a form of problem solving. But I like it a lot. And I actually think it has this other benefit is that the audience gets to feel smart. And so I say keep on doing it because it's pleasurable. Oftentimes applause breaks in a comedy set is not because of the funniest thing that has been said. It's an aha where people go, yes.
That makes sense.
And they're kind of, this is their way to say, you nailed it. I got it. I appreciate it. I like it. This makes sense to me. It's fluent, and so on.
Very cool. Yeah, I like that.
So I'll get you that paper.
Okay.
It's a neat little paper. Okay, we're almost out of time because I know you have other places to go. So wait, you said good story cliffhanger, revise. You got to give me 3. You can't leave 2. 3 is a magic number.
Good story, cliffhanger, revise. I mean, I guess aha would be...
Seek out the aha moment.
Seek out the aha moment.
To get the audience to feel smart.
Yeah.
I like that. So I do this thing where I just started doing it, and sometimes it's about when you do a reveal. So I talk about how like really strong brands don't try to be something for everyone. And like knowing who your target customer is, knowing your limitations, knowing what you're good at, knowing what you're bad at is important. And so I use this example of yeah, California kind of has something for everyone. You know, it's got cities and it's got deserts and it has beaches and it has mountains. But imagine you're in Nebraska. You know, you don't really have big cities, you know, you don't have beaches. You don't have something for everyone, but you have something.
Yeah, yeah.
You know? And then I say, you know, when Nebraska recognized this and they changed their state motto, and then I show the picture of the state motto, and the new state motto is Nebraska. Honestly, we're not for everyone.
I like it.
And it has both the ha-ha, because, you know, it's self-deprecating.
Right.
And then it has the aha, like, I see what you did there. Like, that's kind of a fun little thing.
Is that really their motto?
Yes.
Really?
Yeah, I give them a lot of credit. Give them a lot of credit. Okay, so let's just end with the question I always ask everyone. So we've been talking a lot about creating. You're a master creator. Like, I mean, I'm blown away by how much you produce. So we haven't even talked about your performance on Broadway. Maybe you can tell me quickly about that. But you're also a serial entrepreneur. Like, do you sleep at night? I mean, these are my questions. But
trying to get more sleep, yeah.
Good for you. It's important. So do 2 things for me. One, tell me a little bit about your comedy performance on Broadway. And then I think that the average person over-consumes and under-creates. For such a creator, though, I have to imagine you consume.
Yeah.
And so tell me something that you're reading, watching, or listening to that just stands out, like that inspires you, that you just can't put down or can't stop consuming.
So the first one is my birthday was coming up, actually this year. And my personal trainer is a stand-up comedian, and I've been working out with him for like 8 years.
Okay.
And it's a perfect job for a personal trainer, or a perfect side thing, because he practices jokes on his training clients. Right. So I'll be doing the bench press, and he'll say, so I was walking through Central Park the other day, and I'll be like, I know this is a joke you're testing on me, Andrew. So, and he's great.
What's his name?
Andrew Ginsberg.
Okay.
He's fantastic. He's been performing on Broadway for a long time.
Fun.
And then my sister-in-law is a stand-up comedian here in Los Angeles.
I didn't know that.
Her name's Stephanie Brindis.
Okay.
She's great. They have very different styles of comedy. She talks about doing meth.
What's her
and
last
going to rehab. Brindis, Brindis. So he's kind of more like a Seinfeld type, and she's more of like a shocking type. Anyway, but they're great. I love them both. And then I found out that the drummer in my band in college is one of the top comedians in Albuquerque.
Okay.
And he's amazing.
You're saying that everybody...
So all these weird people in my life are comedians. And so for my birthday, I decided I wanted to put together a show with all of these people in my life. And so Stephanie flew out to New York. Jesse flew out from Albuquerque to New York. I have a buddy who does stand-up in Boston. He came to New York. So I put together this show, and I was the host. And as the host, I was ostensibly going to tell stories about how I knew these people, but I used it as an excuse to practice a bunch of stand-up comedy. And so I ended up doing about 20 minutes
with the world's most favorable audience.
With the world's most favorable audience. And then to do that, I had to do some practice. So I had to go and do some mics. And since then, I've been getting a little more out of my shell and doing that. And actually on a feedback, because I was the host and because of the audience and because, you know, I was telling the stories of how I knew these people, there was some forgiveness on the stuff that didn't hit. But there were a couple of bits that hit really well that now are part of my repertoire. So yeah, it was a lot of fun, and we filmed it, and we're putting it on that particular show. We're putting it on the web.
You'll send me the link?
Yeah, it's taken forever to get the footage. That was a lot of fun. I did a bit about how I think T-Pain is one of the world's greatest writers, and as a writer, I really appreciate.
I love it.
Yeah, so I'll send it to you. You can decide what you think. So that's a comedy thing. But really, it was easier than I thought it would be to start getting into that because of the public speaking already.
Yeah, you have complementary skills.
Yep. So in terms of reading or consuming.
It's just one thing that stands out to you.
I have been reading a couple of history books or biographies that have been really delightful. One is called Cleopatra, A Life.
Okay.
And it's the great biography about her and kind of deconstructing the mythology around Cleopatra and just how much of an effect she had on Rome and kind of on modern society. She's fascinating. So that's one that I'm reading. And then that got me reading. I'm halfway through both of these. Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World. Kind of a similar theme. Character in history that's been mythologized, that when you learn the real story, you see just how much of today was impacted by this one person in history. Genghis Khan, that one is kind of the more exciting one because it's about conquering and stuff.
Yeah.
But the innovations that he did, to me, they make me so happy because he tore apart the way that his society worked, rebuilt it in a way that was much more interesting and innovative. And the way he took over the world, we think of him as this brutal guy. He gets conflated with Attila the Hun a lot, but he did fight a lot of battles. But towards the end of his conquering, he fought almost no battles because he was just an incredible marketer. He would go and show up to a city and he'd say, if you join me, then you'll have my protection and there will be no taxes. You just got to be part of my trade route. And if you don't join me, I will kill all of you but 4. And I'll put each of those guys on a horse to go to the next town in every direction to tell them what happened. And so after you massacre a couple cities this way, and you have a couple cities that spread the news that are like, hey, life under this guy is great because we have no more taxes, suddenly everyone just gives up when you show up.
I see.
So he did a lot of stuff like that was really interesting.
So I need to interrupt with that. Why aren't you and I getting together, and why has there not been a good film about Genghis Khan?
I don't know. Yeah, I have no idea.
Right? The
best Genghis Khan thing in film I can think of is Bill and Ted. When he shows up.
So thank you for supporting my point.
Yeah. I don't know that there has been a really great one.
Right?
Yeah, I'm sure there's been stuff, but it hasn't been good enough to
feels
to
so
rise above.
Ripe, doesn't it?
Yeah. And especially the real story of him being more of this master
exactly.
thinker than, people thought he was brutal, but that was what he wanted you to think.
It fits the anti-hero script much better than the villain script.
Yep.
In any case. Yeah. All right. Shane, thanks so much for doing this.
This has been a pleasure.
I really appreciate it. It's great to get reconnected. Appreciate your time. All right. Cheers.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to visit petermcgraw.org for more information about our guest, show notes, and social media links. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share with others. Join Dr. Peter McGraw next week for another fun, fascinating conversation on I'm Not Joking.